Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Steph Recchia. I hold the John Tower Chair in International Politics here at SMU, and it is my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. So second to my left, we have Ambassador Eric Edelman. He is the Roger Hartog Practitioner in Residence at the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University in DC. Ambassador Edelman has served in senior positions at the Department of State and Defense, as well as the White House. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Finland and Turkey, and was Vice President Dick Cheney's Principal Deputy Assistant for National Security Affairs. Ambassador Edelman has received several awards, including a Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service, a Distinguished Civilian Service Award from the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and a Presidential Distinguished Service Award. Then to my far left, we have General Doug Lute. General Lute has served most recently as the United States Permanent Representative to the North Atlantic Council as NATO, a position in which he retired in 2017. Previously, General Lute had a distinguished 35-year career in the U.S. Army. He also served for a total of 6 years in the White House under both presidents, George W. Bush and Barack Obama. And in 2007, President Bush named him Deputy National Security Advisor to coordinate the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Before being assigned to the White House, General Lute served as Director of Operations, both on the Joint Staff in Washington, D.C., and on the United States Central Command. Then we have on the panel Professor Brett McGurk. He's currently based at the Freeman Spogli Institute at Stanford University. Before moving to Stanford, McGurk served as a special presidential envoy for the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS, and in that capacity, he helped build and lead a broad international coalition in the fight against the terrorist network. Previously, McGurk served in senior positions in the George W. Bush and Barack Obama administration, including in the Bush White House as Senior Director for Iraq and Afghanistan, and then as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Iraq and Iran under President Obama. McGurk has led several sensitive diplomatic missions in the Middle East over the last decade. For example, he led talks with Russia over the Syria conflict under both Presidents Obama and Donald Trump. And finally, the panel discussion this afternoon will be moderated by Professor Hal Brands. Dr. Brands is the Henry Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He is also a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion and a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Brands is the author or editor of many books, including American Grand Strategy in the Age of Trump, published just a year ago, and What Good is Grand Strategy? Power and Purpose in American Statecraft, from Harry Truman to George W. Bush. Professor Brands served as Special Assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Strategic Planning from 2015 to 2016. So please join me in welcoming a very distinguished panel of scholars, practitioners this afternoon.
Well, thank you very much, and I'd also like to thank our hosts here at SMU for putting on this event today. It's a lot of fun to get together with the folks who work to bring this book to fruition, and so many of the policymakers who generously shared their time and insights with us. And it's a pleasure for me to be up here on the stage with three gentlemen who were not only importantly involved in the decision-making that led to the surge and then later in its implementation, but were also very generous with their time and their insights as we told this story. So the basic run of show is that each of them will have a chance to make some comments, and then I will ask a couple of questions of the group, and then we will open it up to general questions and discussion. And so with that out of the way, I will go ahead and hand it off to my friend Derek.
Thank you, Hal. It's great to be here this morning. Thanks to SMU for hosting this, and I want to say it's really a pleasure to be up here on this panel, first with Hal, who is a colleague at Johns Hopkins SAIS, but also with two great public servants, Brett McGurk and Doug Lute. Brett and I have been running a competition to see who is the most hated U.S. government official in Turkey, which both of us, I think, I'll speak for myself, but I think both of us wear as a badge of honor right now. And I've had to yield up my long crown in recent years to Brett, but that's only a compliment to his great work that he did as the coordinator for the counter-ISIL campaign. I would also note that there is a kind of reunion quality to this for all of us. I was sort of surprised we didn't get T-shirts that said 13 Annual Surge Reunion. But I do think that highlights something that speakers in the first panel mentioned, which is the intensely human nature of the decision-making process that is not often captured in scholarly studies of this. And the truth is, a lot of us actually became good friends through this process. And I can't see Megan where she is out there, but Megan and I did not really know each other that well. She had been at CPA while I was ambassador in Turkey, but during the course of this process, we actually became friends. And I think there is something about these governmental processes when you're involved in them. They're, as she said, there's long hours, but there's also a lot of time and political pressure, a lot of stress in all this, and managing all this is very difficult. And for that, I do want to take my hat off to Steve, who managed this whole process. I mean, he and I have known each other longer than either of us want to admit. But if you go around the sit room, and if there were a bubble over everybody's head with their IQ, you'd be surprised at how high the average would be. I mean, you'd go around the room and you'd say, well, 129, 135, 148, 118, 120. If you had their emotional IQs in a bubble over their head, the variance would be much greater. And I think that highlights some of the difficulty of managing this. So thanks, first of all, to Megan, to Peter, to Will Inboden, to Hal, to Jeff Engel, and Timothy Sale for managing this project to completion. I will confess that when they first asked me to do an interview, I was a little bit skeptical, but I think the project and the book that has resulted is an enormously useful and important contribution to both the historical record and the effort to provide an early assessment of both the decision-making process and of the surge itself. I was also struck, I want to say, I'm going to be leaving a little bit early because I got to catch a plane back to Washington this evening because I teach tomorrow at SAIS. So I don't want my absence or my departure to be seen as a political comment on the next panel among the academic contributors to this project, because I was actually struck by the incredibly, I thought, constructive, I would say, measured criticism that they provided. And I agree with some of it, I disagree with some of it, but what struck me about consistently through all of the essays was a fundamental empathy, not a sympathy, but an empathy for the incredibly difficult problems that the participants were wrestling with, and the constraints under which they operated, and the difficulties of reaching a decision with very incomplete information, under excruciating time pressure when a lot of lives were at stake. And I think that's all too often missing from the academic literature, so I would like to just register that. I would go further and say I think that it is important to do projects like this across the board on key decisions made in presidential administrations. And I say that because, speaking now with somewhat dual-hatted nature, because I had a misspent youth in academia, I got a PhD in history before I became a Foreign Service officer, and spent the next 30 years in government. And one of the things that strikes me is that I now have a much greater appreciation of how the documents don't tell the whole story. And that is becoming more acute in the modern era. The documents don't tell the story, whole story, first of all, because there are just too damn many of them now being generated. I think when the Bush administration's emails were accessioned by the National Archives, there were 2 billion of them. The record is becoming just too great for any scholar to actually get their their hands around in its entirety. Moreover, because of the persistent problem of leaks, but also the increasing partisan nature of our politics and the criminalization from time to time of policy differences, documents are much more self-censored now. People write them not just with an eye to what historians might write, but to the fact that they might be subpoenaed. Emails, which a lot of business, and Megan was making the point, emails, a lot of the business gets transacted in email. Emails are frequently very cryptic and will be extremely difficult for historians to sort of decrypt. And then there's a ton of stuff that goes on in phone calls that doesn't show up in a documentary record at all. Steve and I were talking about the fact that he and I had a number of phone calls, frequently on secure lines, in the summer of 2006 as we were wrestling with the fact that there were some folks in the Department of Defense who agreed with Steve and Megan that we needed to have provincial reconstruction teams in Iraq just as we did in Afghanistan, but had a boss who didn't agree, and we had to try and work through that. None of that shows up in the written record. Moreover, and Megan's comments this morning triggered this thought, we frequently don't really have a good record of briefings, which are very crucial. Principal office officials of the government being briefed. I have a very vivid recollection of Steve and I briefing the then Secretary of Defense at 6 o'clock in the morning on the day after the coup in Moscow in 1991, after he was returning from a fishing hole that he described as a place you had to fly to, then take a helicopter, and then take a bus, and then walk to. There's no record of that briefing in the documentary record, and briefing is an art that not everybody understands very well. Megan clearly did an excellent job. I know Steve did in briefing President Bush. I got to see not Megan's but Steve's from time to time. You never know how much time you're going to have, and there's a great story about that, which I'll recount here, which is from the Reagan administration, actually, which the late Frank Carlucci used to tell when he was National Security Advisor to President Reagan. One day, President Reagan saw something in the president's daily brief about Renamo, which was a guerrilla movement in Mozambique, and he got interested in that. And so Frank Carlucci talked to Hank Cohen, who was the senior director on the NSC for Africa, said, "Hank, I need you to brief President Reagan on Renamo." And Cohen said, "How much time do I have?" Carlucci said, "You have 10 minutes. So Cohen went off and did the briefing. He saw Carlucci in the hall a day later and said, "I've got the briefing." He said, "How long is it?" 10 minutes. Carlucci thought for a second and said, "Cut it down to 5. So Cohen went back and cut the briefing down to 5 minutes, ran into Carlucci next day and said, "I've got the briefing down to 5 minutes. Carlucci looked at him and said, "Cut it down to 2 minutes. Cohen goes back and does the briefing. He sees Carlucci in the hall the next day and he says, "I've got the briefing down to 2 words. Carlucci stops and says, "Well, give me the briefing." Cohen said, "Renamo sucks." So briefings, I think, are extremely important. And there were a lot of briefings that went on in this process at various points, some that were part of the official U.S. government effort and some that were not. And those briefings were extremely important, and they need to be captured. So I would like to nominate a couple of additional cases I think people ought to look at. One that comes up a lot in the course of this project and which people talked about in the first panel, which is the original decision to go to war to begin with in 2003. And I firmly believe that all the documentary evidence ought to be declassified, because if ever there were a subject that's ripe for revision, I think that is one of them, and I hope it happens soon enough to allow Mel to complete his book that he's working on the Bush administration. With regard to the surge itself and the story told in the book, I just wanted to add a little granularity from my point of view, from the point of view of DOD and OSD, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which figures a lot in the book. And frequently you'll see references in the book to say, we couldn't do this or couldn't do that because of opposition in OSD. And much as I think in the Vietnam era there were a lot of views about what was going on under Secretary McNamara on Vietnam, I'm thinking in part of then Assistant Secretary for International Security Affairs, John McNaughton, who was in some sense my predecessor because the undersecretary position didn't exist at that time. There was not a unanimity of view in OSD about this. Secretary Rumsfeld had very strong views, but there were a lot of us in OSD who had an enormous amount of sympathy with the idea that we needed to change the mission from train and transition to protection of the population. And it wasn't just me. I think the late Peter Rodman, I think Mary Beth Long, Abe Scholsky, Chris Straub, a lot of people in OSD were sympathetic to this notion. And there were a lot of back-channel conversations going on, not just between me and Steve, but between me and Megan and me and J.D. Crouch, Steve's deputy, with whom all of us had worked in the first Bush administration, to try and help that process along. In fact, in September of 2006, we co-sponsored with the State Department a conference on counterinsurgency, in which we spoke specifically about that, and I gave a speech talking about the importance of actually thinking about population security. And here I think is something that gets a little bit lost. There's a lot of focus on the increase in numbers, the 5 brigades, 2 brigades, 5 brigades, how many brigades we're going to have. And I don't mean to suggest that additional forces didn't make a difference here. They did. Clearly the commanders thought they needed some additional forces. But as Secretary Rice says in her interviews throughout the book, additional forces doing the same thing would not have made a difference. And there's a wonderful chart in the book actually. If you look at the peak of the number of boots on the ground we had in the surge in 2007, which I believe peaked out, someone will correct me if I get this wrong. I think it was Doug will correct me because was it 165? We were almost at that in December of 2005 when we had arranged for some overlap for the election in December of 2005. So the number, I think, was less important here than the change in mission. And that was really the crucial thing that Steve and Megan and Brett and colleagues at the NSC, I think, helped push us to that made all the difference. And I think another person who doesn't get enough credit here is Ray Odierno. There's a lot of discussion about Dave Petraeus and the Field Manual 3.5, the counterinsurgency manual, which focused on population security. And Dave, of course, along with Jim Mattis and others at Fort Leavenworth worked on that. But it was really Ray Odierno as the MNFI commander, the Corps commander, who turned this into operational art on the battlefield with the joint security locations and all of that. And I think that ought to be noted. Now, it's not like a lot of people weren't focusing on counterinsurgency or COIN, as we like to call it, because everything in the Pentagon has to have an acronym. But not everybody really spoke COIN fluently. In fact, as Elliot Cohen likes to say, there were a lot of people in the government who spoke pidgin COIN. And I think for a lot of folks, the emphasis of the counterinsurgency doctrine wasn't so much on the population security part as it was on the all of government part. And we had lots of discussions inside the Pentagon as we went through this, particularly in our defense senior leader meetings, about the whole of government and where was the rest of the government in all of this. Steve got pulled into some of those on occasion by Secretary Rumsfeld. I came to, I'll be interested in Doug's view of this because he sat through a lot of these as well. I came to really loathe these defense senior leader conferences because almost inevitably, we would have a review of what was going on in Iraq, and usually pretty quickly into it, someone, usually General Abizaid, but not only, would say, we're the only department of the US government that's at war. Where's the rest of the government? And the interagency process is not delivering for us, and the interagency process is all screwed up. And who in the Pentagon is in charge of the interagency process? At which point, all eyes in the room would turn on the poor, hapless Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. But we solved that problem with the surge because we sent Doug Lute over to the White House to become the all of government. And
You saw how that worked.
and as the czar to try and pull all of this effort together. And it was a pleasure working with Doug, after he went over there. So I think I will stop there, and I think is Doug next? Or?
Yes, Doug is next.
Okay, so.
Well, thanks again to our hosts and to my fellow panelists here. As I read this book, literally finishing it on the flight down from Washington yesterday, to be honest, I have a set of 4 observations that I want to share with you. Some of this is some of them are sort of memories or sort of flashbacks to a very intense period of policymaking. But let me just share these with you. The first one is about the president himself. And I think the book and the reflections of the 28 contributors reflect the power of presidential expertise. George Bush in late 2006 was not a new president. He was 6 years into an 8-year administration. He had benefited from literally hundreds of engagements on Iraq. He knew Iraq. The German military have a great term for this. I'll try it. Fingerspitzengefühlen. That means a fingertip feel. Is that close? Somebody who speaks German? He knew the texture of the war in Iraq. And he got this from literally hundreds of daily intelligence briefings, the famous PDB, the Presidential Daily Briefing. After 2003, most of them were dominated by the topic on Iraq. He got them from probably 100 plus meetings of his war council. He got this from hundreds of nightly briefing notes that Megan mentioned casually in her remarks. These were famously called inside the National Security Council POTUS notes, so President of the United States, acronym, notes. And for the Iraq-Afghanistan team, this was a daily chore. So around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we put out an all-hands call among this sort of squad of us who were dealing with Iraq and Afghanistan, and we gathered the most recent, most current developments and put them in a 1, 2, 3-page memo to the president. This went on for years. He got this expertise from personal, close engagements with all the participants on the US side, to include the military commanders, but also with his Iraqi counterparts. So by 2006, when he was struggling with this question of sectarian violence that was spinning out of control, he was not an amateur on Iraq. And the power of presidential expertise, I think, gets lost a little and is not made as explicit as it should be in the telling of the story. But it underpins his ability to ask the right questions, to challenge the assumptions, and to sort of nursemaid this project, this process, to its conclusion. And I think that's really important. The other thing that was not there in the president's office by 2006 was a sense of hubris. By 2006, 3 years into the Iraq War, we didn't harbor sort of starry-eyed visions of what was possible in Iraq. We'd been through that period, if there was such a time. I wasn't there at the time and going into Iraq in 2003. But the president was very sort of sober and prudent and experienced in a way that brought, I think, a certain sense of level-headed sort of humility to the decision-making process. We shouldn't miss that. This process could have percolated below any president, but it was connected in this case to a president who was increasingly expert on the issue at hand, and was humble about our ability to affect things on the ground. All of that sets the stage for the decision process that the book covers. Second observation has to do with the process. It was mentioned earlier that Steve Hadley, I think, largely was the central figure in running a process of the National Security Council, so the War Council, if you will, and the deputies and sub-deputies of the War Council principals. So 1 or 2 levels deep into the national security bureaucracy. But running a process that was fundamentally open, transparent, and based on trust. This is a very important, and I think too little appreciated quality of a successful process. Why is trust so important? It's important, first of all, because it best serves the president. It gets the president the full range of policy options when everyone trusts that his and her voice, that their bureaucratic voices will be heard. But it also is hugely important, and the book doesn't take this on, but it's hugely important for the next book, which is the implementation of the surge. Because a trusting decision-making process where everyone feels heard and everyone feels respected enables successful execution. And you can imagine a process that isn't trusted, that features a lot of backstabbing and a lot of second-guessing and is played out in the press, right? And how difficult that process would be to execute, because people would feel they weren't heard, and they essentially take the somewhat teenager approach of, well, now I'll be heard in the execution process, right? And there are execution insurgencies that take place and so forth. The surge decision did not have to deal with that in execution. And that was largely a product of the decision-making process itself. So that kind of process, run by Steve and nurtured by the president, was very important to the success of the surge, which is actually the next book, right? It's the implementation phase. I saw this actually firsthand as a minor participant in the surge decision, but as a more central figure in the implementation a few months later. And my job as an implementer of the surge, when I left the Joint Staff and came to the White House working for Steve and President Bush, was vastly simplified and enabled by the fact that it was the product of a trusting decision-making process. So I think the process deserves attention. My third point, third observation, is it reflects on a subplot that sort of is woven throughout the book. And this is the plot between, or in the relationship between the security situation in Iraq and the politics in Iraq. Up to the point of the surge, so for roughly the first 3 years of the war in Iraq, we had prioritized the assumption that improved politics, an increasingly inclusive Iraqi political process, would deliver security. So in short, the first approach was politics first. And this had to do with turning sovereignty over to the Iraqi government, creating an Iraqi constitution, holding elections, forming governments, and all this sort of thing. And the sense was, if we could get Sunnis, Shia, and Kurds to work together politically, they'd have no reason to fight, right? And we could contain any violence while the political process matured. By 2006, it was clear that the sectarian violence was overwhelming that approach. And it was insufficient. The politics were insufficient to quell the violence. And we were on a downward spiral. A piece of the surge decision that I just want to make explicit by way of my own observation is that what the surge decision actually did was invert. It turned on its head this relationship between politics in Iraq and security in Iraq. And the surge essentially admitted that there is a security threshold that must first be attained to enable the politics. So in a way, we turned from politics first to security now, security first. And I think this actually played out in the year or so after the surge decision, because we saw that once sectarian violence was quelled, Prime Minister Maliki was able to take some pretty bold political steps. I mean, it was Maliki, after all, who, within a year of the surge decision, marched on Basra. And onto whom did he march? He marched on Shia militia, his own political allies, former allies, when he went to quell Shia-prompted violence in Basra. It was within 18 months of the surge decision that same Prime Minister Maliki signed a strategic framework agreement and later a status of forces agreement with President Bush, one of the last things President Bush did before leaving office in late 2008, that enabled U.S. forces to stay for another 3 years. And it was Maliki who was able to get that political decision through a 2/3 majority in the Iraqi parliament. Those political moves were enabled by the improved security that was delivered by the surge. So there's a bigger strategic move here. It's not just about 30,000 troops, okay? It's about this strategic inversion that put security first. So I've come to believe that there's a certain sufficiency, there's a certain requirement, minimum requirement for security that then enables politics, and I call that the security threshold. The fourth and final comment I have is a concern that we take a broader view of cause and effect when we consider the effects of the surge. The book, look, we're all Americans. I suppose most of us are Americans in this room, right? And so we have, I think, maybe naturally assumed that this American decision delivered a particular effect on the ground. That is a dramatic decrease in sectarian violence within months, by the way, within only a couple months of the surge hitting the ground in Iraq. I think it's worth thinking about. Maybe this is along Eric's line of the next book, another book, thinking about the other effects that caused a decrease in sectarian violence, which are not American effects, fundamentally. Let me just list a couple that come to the top of my list, right? First is Muqtada al-Sadr, the head of the Sadrists, with his own militia, the Jaish al-Mahdi, JAM as we acronymized it, took to the sidelines. So Muqtada took his Shia militia off the battlefield, okay? That naturally had a suppressive effect on sectarian violence. Number two, on the Sunni side, the Sunni awakening predated the surge by probably about a year. Well into 2006, you began to get the swinging of the Sunni Arab tribes, especially in Anbar, and that was obviously before the surge. So there's a Sunni part of this. I think there's an argument to be made that a lot of the sectarian violence was beginning to burn out, that mixed sectarian neighborhoods, especially in Baghdad, had essentially been cleansed by the summer of 2007 when the last surge brigade arrived. Now that's not a very attractive policy option to essentially cleanse these mixed neighborhoods, but I think a lot of that had already taken place by the time the surge got there. And then finally, I think we give too little credit to Stan McChrystal and the Joint Special Operations Command impact on the major accelerant to sectarian violence, and that was the JSOC campaign against Zarqawi and Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So these were the folks who were pouring gasoline, essentially, on the sectarian fires. So all of these sort of other effects or other causes, I think have a role to play in what Dave Petraeus and Ryan Crocker were able to observe when they went back on Labor Day weekend in September of 2007. Now, that's 2 or 3 months after the last surge troops arrived. So a very short period. And they were able to say to the Congress and to the American people, we're seeing the early signs of a decrease in sectarian violence. So I'd be a little cautious here among the historians in the room and so forth, that we have sort of a cause and effect relationship between the surge itself and what we saw on the ground. I think it's a multivariable equation.
Thank you, Doug. I'm really honored to be here. It's great to see Eric and be on this panel with Hal and be here with Steve and all of you. Let me first say, I am not in the book, despite many conversations with Peter and I, because in 15, 16, 17, 18, I was spending a lot of time in Iraq and Syria in this campaign against ISIS, and particularly in Syria, so that the events of what just happened are particularly on my mind. And I think this is very timely because it's about what can we really do as a country. We talk about ends, ways, and means, the means being not just the brigades, it's our will as a country and our capacity for leadership. I think it's such an open question now. It's very troubling. I also, before I talk about the surge, I always put up front the cost of the surge. About 1,000 Americans were killed in the first year of the surge. And I don't think we can ever forget that. And certainly President Bush, and this is about these decisions. I talk a little bit at Stanford about decision making, and I have people in Silicon Valley who talk about how they make decisions. It's hard to even see them as comparable. These decisions are the most important, the weightiest, the most consequential for our country, for our history, for men and women who volunteer to wear the cloth of our country. And President Bush felt that. And I'm going to tell some stories, so indulge me for my experience in this, but just one, the day after the speech announcing he's sending what became 30,000 more American troops to Iraq, which was a wildly unpopular decision, if you put yourself in that time. We went to Fort Benning, and the president spoke with a number of Americans who would be heading over to Iraq. And it was a pretty draining day, and we had worked on this policy. I felt very strongly that it was the right policy. I'll talk about why, and you've read it in the book. But even after all those meetings that we had, President Bush then went and spent about an hour with Gold Star families behind closed doors. And so this was a president who was living and breathing this war, as he's written since every day. But until the surge decision, I think it's fair to say he's living it, he's breathing it, he's struggling with it, as Steve saw every day, far more than I did, obviously, in those days. But he wasn't really commanding the war. And the surge, as Doug gets to, it wasn't just the decision, it was how complete change in the management of the conflict in Iraq. So let me just go through a little bit of my experience, and I will do an interview, so I'll be up on the web so you can see. On September 11th, 2001, I was a law clerk for Chief Justice Rehnquist on the 9/11 attacks. I learned about those attacks from him. I was on a path to be a lawyer and have a nice career in the law, which I really enjoyed. That obviously changed the course of our history, and in 2003, I was in private practice, and I got a call from a friend in the fall of 2003, a former colleague of mine, who had just come out of an interagency meeting, which I didn't even know what that meant at the time, and said, they're looking for people to go to Iraq to help with their political process, their constitutional process. Would you be willing to go? And this was in the fall of 2003, 4 or 5 months into the war. And I said yes immediately, and I got to Iraq in early January 2004. As many people who went to Iraq in that period, it was pretty clear very early on that we were into something we didn't fully understand, we didn't fully anticipate. I felt immediately that we didn't have enough resources to deal with this problem. From the airport, the drive from the airport to the coalition headquarters was a very harrowing ride, the highway of death. Megan and I worked on the political process in that year. So this is 2004, so a lot of major decisions have already been made. But we made a lot of progress on the political process. We did an interim constitution, which was successful. We transitioned from the Paul Bremer era. We set up an embassy. We set up an interim Iraqi government. The politics were kind of working, but the violence was not getting any better. And there was a debate among very senior officials in Baghdad, which I witnessed as a very young person, I'm 32 years old at the time, about this debate that Doug talked about, is it security or politics? And the idea that politics would drive security gains, and those, frankly, of us working the politics are saying, no, without a baseline of security, there is no politics. Security problem is a security problem. In any event, Megan became the senior director at the NSC and asked me to join her staff. And I joined the White House in 2005. And I think it's safe to say that in our office, we had all spent a lot of time in Iraq. And And we believed there was this disconnect between security and politics, but there was always a hope there's going to be an election, there's going to be a constitutional referendum, that this will turn the corner. So there was enough to not really force a fundamental reassessment. I was also, as a young guy, as a director at the time, you don't interact with the president all that much, and I was always wondering, how's the president seeing this? Because what he was saying publicly, he wants to succeed, nothing more important, but it seemed we were so focused on transitioning to the Iraqis, that was a policy, that we were not really making any significant progress. My first time in the Oval with him, as a note taker for a meeting with a senior Iraqi official with Megan and Steve, I was shocked. First of all, you walk in the Oval for the first time, your shoulders kind of snap back. I'd never seen the president in person, so you feel like you're kind of on a movie set. I've been in there a lot now with Obama too. He was so demanding and like inquisitive of Megan, like a ruthless inquisitor about the situation, what's going on. I thought, wow, this president is not only living and breathing this thing, he is asking all the right questions and wants to succeed. And as we got into 2006, and the situation deteriorated after the Samarra mosque bombing, that is when, and I think the historical record, I am working on a book project. I've been working on a book project for like 10 years on this. So someday this will come out, but the archives have been very friendly with me. And I've gone back and looked at some of the POTUS notes, and I think I've gotten a couple of them, at least for my own use. They hold up. And we were reporting, this is a very serious situation, it is deteriorating. And Steve would send those to the president every night, sometimes with his handwritten notes, and the president would read them every night with his handwritten notes. The president was getting a somewhat different reporting stream from the ambassador in Baghdad, from some of the commanding generals at the time. And there's always this question, how does the president reconcile these different streams of information? And I think the way he saw as the commander-in-chief, kind of a classical model delegating to the command, to the chain of command. And I think that's the traditional model, the kind of first war model, the first Gulf War model. But as the situation deteriorated, Steve pushed us very hard, eventually, to relook at everything. It began very quietly. And Megan, myself, the intelligence community was really critical here. We had great inroads there. Became pretty convinced after a lot of work that we had to do something radically different. And that would require more resources. It would require a very different strategy focused on securing the population in key areas. And that would be costly. We would sometimes write reports and go see Steve Hadley, and I remember, Steve, you said to us once, this is before we started the formal review, are you guys sure about this? And we said, Steve, we've really done the work, and we've talked to all these people, and this is months of work. We're sure. And I never knew where you stood, actually, until the very end, because you held your cards very close. But the only time I've ever heard Steve say a bad word, he said, you better be damn sure, because think of what you're asking the president to do. And he was right. And Steve not only drove us, he drove the entire interagency once we began the review. So if we did this, we were all certain that this was the right thing to do. And I feel that that was the right process. I have concluded, after working in 3 administrations, that these decisions of war and peace, the model is the surge review. And it is the opposite to what we're seeing now. The night the president made the speech on January 7th, we were in Steve Hadley's office, myself, I think Megan, and we watched the speech on TV. We had done a poll about, would the American people support sending 20, 30,000 troops to Iraq? I think it came back like 28%, which is a pretty low number. There was a poll that same week, I just happen to remember, that Americans that believe in alien-piloted UFOs, something like 10 points higher than this decision. So this was a really unpopular decision. And but we watched the speech. It was a very somber speech. You might remember the president did it, I think, in the library room with the books behind him. And then the senators came out and gave their reviews, and the reviews were pretty rough. And Josh Bolton came in because he had been with the president, and he came in the office and said the president feels very good about the process. He said, thank you. And Josh said something to the effect, and the president's taken charge of this. Something to that effect. I don't remember the exact quote. But the last 2 years, the president, his first briefing every morning was on Iraq. Every Monday morning for 2 years, there was an NSC meeting on Iraq, which is extraordinary. From what I've been able to see, nothing comparable other than Eisenhower, the way he ran the NSC. Personal hands-on management of this war over the last 2 years. And that is why a lot of this succeeded. Bringing in Doug Lute as an assistant to the president for the day-to-day management, the constant engagement from the president with senior leaders in Iraq and in the region at critical times. This played out a number of ways. There was a time in the fall where myself, Ryan Crocker, Dave Petraeus decided we're done with Maliki. And some Iraqis wanted to get rid of Maliki. And we wrote a memo. It's time for Maliki to go, as if we could make that happen. And Doug is absolutely right. We tend to forget about the agency of other countries. But the president asked us some hard questions. And he asked us the hardest one, well, who's going to come after Maliki? And we said, well, actually, the Iraqis haven't really figured that out. And the president completely shut down that entire conversation, not just with us, but with some of the Iraqis who were kind of maneuvering against Maliki. That was the right call, because had we lost Maliki, we would have had 6 months without a government at a critical time. We had some issues with the CENTCOM commander and Dave Petraeus, which were tense, which the president really, I think, helped manage. And finally, the Battle of Basra. Maliki goes into Basra without really planning it, gets himself in trouble. For some reason, I think, Doug, you might have been overseas, so I was kind of manning the fort in the White House, and Ryan Crocker and Dave Petraeus both told me, you have to tell the president that Maliki needs to, he bit off more than he can chew. He needs to get out of Basra, get back to Baghdad. This is a disaster. And I walked in the Oval Office that morning with Steve to explain, here's what our people are saying, here's the desperate situation. And the president, without even a briefing, said, the cat, everyone told me this cat, Maliki, isn't going to go after the Shia militias. He's going after the Shia militias, and we're going to make sure he wins. And that's what we did. We sent forces down there. It was a key turning point in the campaign. And that was not the advice of his senior people. The SOFA also, which this is an untold story, but a very smooth transition to a president who ran against the war and came in, and the first thing he said, and I was there, you were there, President Obama said, I don't want to mess this up, which was a tribute to all the work that had been done. And we can talk about whether it later on was messed up, but that's another story. But the way this decision was made, the process, what it says about being a commander-in-chief, what it says about the care when you send young men and women overseas. I think it is an interesting debate that had this surge review happened in the run-up to the war, how the war might have been differently resourced, differently managed. That's an interesting question for historians. I was not there at that time. But anyway, this is a very worthy project, and I'm very honored to be here. I'm sorry I was not in the book, but I promise I will get my interview done so you can see it. Thank you.
So those were three very rich sets of comments that have triggered a number of questions on my part. And so I'm going to ask a couple of questions that have to do with process, a couple of questions that have to do with content, and then a question that has to do with outcomes, all of which you gentlemen have touched on a little bit, but I'd like to go a little bit deeper. And so the first question has to do with what we're actually talking about when we talk about the surge review, because I think if you look at the book, and if you look at some of the interviews, for folks who haven't had a chance to take a look at it, when people talk about the surge review, they're sometimes talking about a few different things. And so there was the formal interagency review, which happened late in the fall of 2006 under the direction of the Deputy National Security Advisor, who of course reported to Steve Hadley and the President. But that actually came relatively late in the game. And prior to that, there were a variety of efforts to relook at the Iraq strategy in different parts of the government. And so there was an effort to do this Within the NSC, there was an effort to do this at the Joint Staff. There were efforts to do this in other parts of the government as well. And so I'm curious, because you three were all in different places within the bureaucracy, OSD, the NSC, the Joint Staff, what level of visibility did you have on the fact that there was this broader ferment happening at different places within the government with respect to Iraq's strategy? Were you aware that was happening? Was there cooperation between different groups that were thinking about the same questions, or was this something that remained pretty closely stovepiped until the formal interagency review began?
It's a good question, Hal. It's a little bit hard to answer for the reason that Megan gave in her comments, which is, there was a lot of conversation and exchanges going on constantly about this set of issues. So, for instance, certainly I was aware of the effort in June to have the meeting at Camp David. I will confess that I myself at that point was a little bit unsure after what happened in February at the Al-Askari Mosque about whether we really needed to change course or whether this was something we could manage, in part because we had no government in Iraq, which was a big concern to me. And I still think that was one of the major factors. I don't think we touch enough on it. It doesn't touch enough on the book. But the absence of an Iraqi government from January until June might have been okay absent the bombing. But once the bombing happens and there's no government, obviously people feel they have to protect themselves. And it's in that period you see this skyrocketing enrollment in various militias, particularly Shia militias, that's taking place. But in June, just as the Camp David meeting was happening, I happened to be in Baghdad. I happened to be having dinner with George Casey the night that Stan McChrystal and his JSOC guys killed Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. So Zarqawi gets killed, and we now have a government in Iraq. So I think the natural tendency that certainly I had, I can't speak for others, was, okay, maybe this is a turning point. I think as Brett just said correctly, there were a lot of times where people felt we've got a development now, or there's one coming that's going to change the direction of this. You have to go through that probably a few times, and then realize, okay, there's not going to be some deus ex machina that's going to save us. We're going to have to do some things, differently. We were very constrained in OSD by the Secretary's views, and that was just a reality. I was aware that the Council of Colonels was going on. That was not something that Pete Pace kept secret from us, and I was having conversations, some with Megan, mostly with J.D. Crouch. I remember very distinctly we had these devices, I don't even know if they exist anymore, Tandberg devices, which were a kind of video telephone. And I know kind of very late in the day, quite frequently JD and I would get on and talk about this. And JD was saying, we need to do something different. And I said, yeah, I agree with you. How are we going to get there? And he said, well, we're working on some things. So, I knew vaguely that it was going on. I wasn't, aware of all the specific dimensions of it.
It's a great question. The Camp David meeting is interesting because that's when we thought, and this is reflected somewhat in the book, but that was going to be a key moment, that hard questions were going to be asked. But it ended up being a cover also for a secret trip to Baghdad from the president to see Maliki, and there was kind of a sense we have a new government, and things were moving. I have to say, it's reflected in the book, but nobody supported sending more forces to Iraq. It was like a very small number. Some of the colonels in the Council of Colonels, but not the consensus. State Department, we had a debate about clear, hold, build in 2005, which would have been a kind of counterinsurgency type thing. That didn't go anywhere, and the State Department really swung totally against any real talk of more resources. So from our perch, it was frustrating. And then there were things outside of my purview, even just next door to me. Steve Hadley asked Bill Lute, who worked, I think, 2 doors down from Megan and I, to do Bill's a military planner, to actually look at this. Is this even feasible militarily? And I didn't know Bill was working on that. So there was a lot going on outside of our purview, and I think a lot of it probably reflected conversations, obviously, the National Security Advisor is having with the President, as it should. But from our perch, we were doing the work as best we could. And I think everybody was also dealing with their own principles and their own views. So it was complex, but as it came out and everything came together, and I remember the first time I met you, Doug, as the J3, I said, hey, could we send 5 more brigades to Iraq? Like, what does this look like? You said, you could, but you wouldn't really have much of an army left. I mean, it was kind of like, it was the view, yeah, something like it. The view was that, for those who might say we should send more forces to Iraq, the risks it might take on elsewhere around the world were going to be extremely high. So just from my vantage point, it just gets to how controversial this was and how difficult this was. Because there was a lot going on, but there wasn't that much going on that would have led to this result until the very late in the day we had the formalized review.
Yeah, Hal, I think the short answer to this is that there were compartmented, sort of segregated approaches happening at different pockets of the bureaucracy. And they didn't really come together until the J.D. Crouch hosted review in sort of the last, 6 weeks or 2 months of 2006. There was a reason that these were isolated and segregated. They were even isolated within the bureaucracies. So for example, the Joint Staff version of this review, independent review, was this Council of Colonels. Well, that's interesting. Why were they colonels? They were colonels because there were generals above them that opposed a formal review of the status quo option, to include a couple 4-stars. So this was sort of done as an off-the-charts, quiet, in the basement of the Pentagon study among knowledgeable colonels, but it was also reasonably deniable and isolated and segregated because there were antibodies within the uniformed military to reviewing a strategy that both the CENTCOM commander and the commander in Iraq favored. And I think the same is true in the NSC, the same is true at state, and so forth. So we had to get sufficient understanding of the problem internal to these little pockets of the bureaucracy so that the position of the department, the position of the Joint Staff, had sufficient gravity, or maybe it was sufficiently organic so that it could be brought out into the open. And that's what, inside the Joint Staff, the Council of Colonels did. They eventually briefed the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so this is the committee of the 4 service chiefs plus the chairman and the vice chairman in this famous windowless conference room called the Tank. And the Council of Colonels briefed this out. And that's when the serious discussion began inside the Joint Staff. But I think that sort of mimics or parallels the process elsewhere in the bureaucracies. It had to sort of start at the grassroots level and become serious, gain gravity, and then it could be brought up into the equivalent of the Tank. So it was segregated initially.
Just to add quickly, so as I recall, Steve will correct me if I'm wrong, but Bill Lute's study was probably one of the last big projects he did before he left the NSC, because I think he left that fall to go to the private sector. And I found out about his study when he came to pay his out call on me at the Pentagon. And as he was walking out the door, he said, oh, by the way, if the Joint Staff tells you that we don't have any more brigades to send to Iraq, I just did a study. We got 5 more brigades we can send. Don't listen to anything they tell you. And so I knew that that had happened. And that was in roughly about the same time that Ray Odierno came to see me on his way out to become the Corps commander in Baghdad under George Casey. And he came to me and said, Eric, I think I need more troops. He was then the Corps commander down at Fort Hood, I think, right at 3 Corps. And he said, I think I'm going to need more troops. And this was after Secretary Rumsfeld had resigned, but before Secretary Gates had been sworn in because he didn't get sworn in until he'd presided over the A&M graduation, just for all of you folks in Texas to show how important that is. And so I was living with this very uncomfortable situation where I had the outgoing Secretary of Defense on the 3rd floor of the E-ring and the incoming Secretary of Defense on the 4th floor. And I said, Ray, I'm very, very sympathetic about you getting these troops, but I've got a secretary who's leaving who's against it, and I got a new secretary coming in who I haven't had a chance to brief yet, and we're going to have to see where all that goes.
So just because a couple of you have mentioned this now, one of the very fine-grained but interesting stories that emerges out of this broader tale involves this question of whether there were actually additional troops available for the surge. And what's remarkable is that you get widely different answers to this question depending on where you were in the government. And so sort of the official DOD answer was that no, troops are not available, but the NSC staff came up with a different answer. And so I'm curious, why were people coming up with different answers to this question? Was it based on different methodologies? Was it reflecting policy disagreements within the government? Was it based on different assessments of how much risk the United States could take on in other theaters or with other commitments? What was driving these widely divergent outcomes? For anyone who wants to take a crack.
I think that's a question for the J3. So.
Okay, so this is a case where it's important to get inside the question being asked and to probe the assumptions inherent with the question. So at that time, we had 15 brigades in Iraq. I think we had 2 in Afghanistan, and we probably had maybe 50 brigades on the books overall in the force structure. So if you simply ask the question, are there 5 more brigades available, and say, well, there's 15 here, there's 2 there, there's 1 in Korea, there's a couple in Korea, there's a couple in Germany, the answer is, yeah, sure. I mean, the purely mathematical answer. The Joint Staff, however, was working under an assumption when we gave the answer that we're out of Schlitz. I don't think they make Schlitz anymore. In fact, this use of that phrase may have retired the Schlitz company. I'm not sure. But we said that we were out of Schlitz, and there were not 5 brigades available because our assumption was that we were going to retain the basic operating principles of 1 year deployed and 1 year not deployed for a brigade. And in order to set up that rotation schedule, you needed 3 brigades to put 1 in Iraq. Okay, you needed the one that was there, the one that was preparing to go, and the one that had just come back. And you couldn't sort of change that simple rotation math. So when we said you're out of Schlitz, we were saying, we were implying that if you hold to the 1 year in combat and 1 year out of combat, that we were in fact out. Now, having read the book and now thought about this, what I should have said, right, is you're out of Schlitz if we stick to 1 year, right, for a particular brigade. However, if you change that math, as we eventually were forced to do to sponsor the surge, and kept U.S. troops in combat for 15 months and allowed them to come back and take a 1 year break, so we went to a 15-12 rotation, you could in fact squeeze the last 5 brigades out of the force structure. But so this is very much a question of probing the question being asked and making sure that you uncover underlying assumptions. And I wish, if I had something I wish I could have contributed to a different book, would be that early on in the process I said, well, of course you can get 5 more brigades. In fact, you can get 50 brigades if you want to send them all over there at once forever, right? In a sort of a World War II model. But let's probe the assumptions. And what the Joint Chiefs were most concerned about is that in this first war with the all-volunteer force. So these are all volunteers. Nobody's drafted in this equation that we're talking about, right? And it was largely a married force, a family-based force, that violating the 12 in and 12 out model would have fundamental repercussions on the health of the force. And quite candidly, I'm not sure that when we went to 15 months, that we began to erode that confidence in the force. But I think there's still a lot of research to be done about the stress of not just the surge decision, but sustained combat over these, what you might call the Bin Laden decade plus, right, on the all-volunteer force. And you see this in things like PTSD, you see this in things like retention rates in the services, and you see this by way of traumatic brain injury, exposure to multiple concussions that tend to be the most common the most common effects on the battlefield. And I think some of these long-term physical and mental health impacts, and this isn't directly related to the surge, but it is related to employing an all-volunteer force as we have for so long, and really sort of the human experimenting that's going on with this exposure of this force to sustained combat. Now, very gratefully, in recent years, our numbers are much lower in these sort of combat situations. And in particular, largely to Brett McGurk's and his military colleagues in the war against ISIS, in the fight against ISIS, we've happened on a different model where we don't have to Americanize the effort. And we're not dealing with 15 brigades or 20 brigades. We're dealing with much smaller, more sustainable forces keyed to partnership with capable indigenous partners. That's a very different model, but that's not the model we were talking about here in Iraq. We had very much American soldiers in the lead. So that's the lesson. The personal lesson for me is, probe the question and make sure you understand the assumptions that are based on the question at hand.
Just, 2 quick points. I think global risk is an interesting one. I do remember discussions in the tank with the president and the chiefs about, the chiefs would say, you're taking a lot more risk of a potential, if there's a conflict in Korea or somewhere else. And the president always made clear, we win the wars we're in to help us stay out of future wars. I mean, he was very clear on that in terms of priority settings. I think that's a conversation that goes on in any relationship between, I think, the chiefs and the president. On this last point Doug made, just because it's in the news, the counter-ISIS campaign was deliberately, completely different. We relied on local actors. So in Syria, the local force, we built a force of 60,000 Syrians. They took about 10,000, 11,000 casualties. 5 or 6 Americans were killed in Syria. And the cost to U.S. taxpayer, the surge, about $250 billion total. The entire 4 or 5 year campaign against ISIS, about $25 billion. Plus, we had a huge coalition sharing those costs, which is why I don't want to get off topic, but when President Trump says he's ending endless wars, and it doesn't make any sense. I mean, this was a totally sustainable model, totally sustainable. There's no clamor in Congress, there's no clamor. It was working. We weren't fighting, we weren't losing American lives, we weren't spending much money. So that's why I think for the consensus to build, that there's a pushback to this, that we can't even do that. I think the repercussions are quite serious.
Just a footnote, Doug, correct me if I'm wrong. We all talk about 5 brigades going to the surge, but as I recall, as he went out, Dave Petraeus also wheedled a rotary wing support element that was a kind of brigade equivalent, so he really had like 6.
So, Eric, maybe this is a question for you. Brett wasn't the only one who managed to dodge us for this book. Secretary Rumsfeld also does not appear as much as he might, because he declined to be interviewed, or rather said yes and then said no a number of times. But his presence is here, and so I think the traditional narrative about Secretary Rumsfeld's role is that he was an obstructive presence in this story, that he was opposed to any change of strategy in Iraq, and it was only when he departed from the administration that this change was possible. And so given that you had a pretty good window into DoD thinking, given your perch heading OSDP, is that an accurate view of Secretary Rumsfeld's role? And if so, why did he play this role? Or is it mistaken in some way?
Secretary Rumsfeld had a reputation for riding roughshod over his general officers in the Pentagon. And my view of it was slightly different. I viewed him as a kind of equal opportunity abuser. I mean, he didn't just rough up, general officers. And Doug had been on the receiving end of this. So was I multiple times. That was his, sort of MO. In reality, at least during the time I was there, from summer of 2005 on, I never saw him overrule a 4-star. And in particular, he shared, I think, genuinely, General Abizaid's view that it was our presence that was driving the animosity among Iraqis and driving the violence. And we had to train and transition and turn this over to Iraqis. It recurs repeatedly in the book, the phrase, we've got to take our hand off the bicycle seat, and let the Iraqis handle this on their own. We can't do this for them forever. And he and General Casey and General Abizaid, I think, all very genuinely shared that view. Now, for those of us who had a slightly different view, that made life a little complicated because, you work for one secretary at a time, and I had to execute what the secretary thought was the right thing to do. Now, that didn't stop me from, getting a copy of the counterinsurgency field manual. My military assistant had been General Petraeus's chief strategist at Minsticky when he was running the training mission, and so he was in touch with Petraeus. I got a copy of that field manual and got it at John Hanna's request to Vice President Cheney, so Vice President Cheney could read the field manual. I got John Noggle, who was an expert in counterinsurgency, who was working for the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Gordon England, down the hall from me, first I got him to get me a copy of David Galula's classic book on counterinsurgency, French general who'd fought in Algeria, which had just been reprinted. I got John first to get it to me when I first got to DOD in August of 05. But then his book on counterinsurgency came out. I had him take a copy over and brief Vice President Cheney on that. So we were, some of us were trying to work, within the interstices of the system to try and get some of these ideas percolating. But, we had to, abide by the Secretary's view, which he came by honestly. I mean, the other view he had was the one that Doug was just talking about, which was about the health of the force and the rotation base and sustaining it. So he had his own, good and sufficient reasons for the positions that he took. I just had come to the conclusion that we were beyond the point where those views were going to get us, a successful outcome.
So one of the themes that's come up in a number of remarks so far, but I'd like to ask about it more systematically, is this question of whether the surge had to happen when it did or whether it might have come about earlier. Because I think there are widely divergent appraisals of what the surge accomplished, and I'll ask about that in a second. But I think one of the points of consensus is that it came about quite late in the game, after about 3.5 years of war, and quite a lot of cost had been incurred. And so would it have been possible to come to a similar policy with a similar outcome 6 months earlier or a year earlier or even 3 months earlier? Or did the surge depend on a convergence of circumstances that was only possible at the very end of 2006?
I incline to the latter, Hal. I think it's a hard question to really answer, but I incline to the latter. I think one of the things you have to remember, this is not really addressed that much in the book, but the Iraqi security forces we were training in 04 and 05 were not or in 03 and 04, I should say, I'm sorry. When Paul Eaton was handling the mission, were not trained to do any kind of internal defense or deal with internal security issues. It was meant to be a mechanized army that would protect Iraq from outside predatory powers in its neighborhood, but not be available to do what, you know, Saddam had the military do domestically in Iraq. And it was only when Dave Petraeus took over Minsticky and started to train a force, and then Marty Dempsey, that was capable of carrying out counterinsurgency and counterterrorism missions, that we would have had the Iraqi partners to be able to execute the surge, in my view. So we needed to take the time to build up that Iraqi force with which we could partner, because doing this by ourselves would have been, not a sustainable thing. We had to do it with Iraqis who we could pass it off to. And I don't think the Iraqi counterterrorism force gets nearly enough credit. I mean, Brett knows more about this than I do, but we fought those guys crazy in the fight to take Iraq back from ISIL. They carried an enormous amount of the burden, but you had to train them. They had to be there first in sufficient numbers. I think we were up around 350, Doug, is that right? 350,000, something like that, Iraqi security forces by the summer of '06. I doubt we could have done this with less than that.
I think the interesting question is, when do you, in any campaign strategy, you have to adapt as it runs into the real world. The question is, when do you have a process to adapt? And you can't constantly have strategic reviews. It was a confluence of events in 2006 that kind of forced this. But I think it was pretty clear pretty early, a lot of the assumptions with which we went into Iraq were not correct. I think the support of the local population, the resilience of existing institutions, and then with the disbandment of the army and everything else, I think a strategic review earlier on might not have led to the surge, but might have led to some adaptation. And from our vantage point, which was frustrating, was that Secretary Rumsfeld did have a very broad mandate in the CPA area and others. So there was and when I got the NSC, it was just a sense that the president had limited maneuvering room to adapt, because the views of the CENTCOM commander, General Abizaid, who obviously was very influential and incredibly knowledgeable about the region, he had a very fixed set of views, which were then reflected by the Secretary of Defense, and that's the chain of command. So the president either is going to overrule or redirect his chain of command, or I think any president, I saw this with Obama too, well, not all the time, but you're delegating to the chain of command. These are your people. So the president to kind of redirect that's a very, I think, unnatural instinct for a president. So the question is, when do you actually adapt? The last 2 years, once we did the surge, the president, very seasoned president, he's taken command of the war. We adapted a lot throughout the campaign. I mean, we made a lot of decisions. And I don't think we would have succeeded in the 2 years without that constant reevaluation with the president, directly hands-on management of the war. And I have concluded, again, after 3 administrations, at risk of repeating myself, if a president is going to send his men and women overseas to be involved in a big war or a little war, he has to be directly involved in this. That doesn't, he's a lot of things to do, but regularly brief, know what's going on, so that when a crisis happens, which is inevitable, he kind of understands the situation and you can adapt effectively. And I think President Bush did that quite well from the surge on.
So I think it was a combination of events on several fronts in 2006 that led us to look at this more fundamentally. First of all, there was the spiking of sectarian violence. This, of course, was inflamed by the Zarqawi attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque and so forth, right? So you can plot sectarian violence, and it spiked in 2006. The second was that we actually did show some progress after the December 2005 Iraqi elections. And then Maliki, by June of 2006, had finally formed a government, right? I remember for months we didn't have an Iraqi minister of defense. Well, how incapable is that, right? But he actually formed a government. So we thought we were still on track, right, with the politics first model. And here you have a newly seated government. He's got, sort of sectarian representation across the government. It's somewhat inclusive, and, looks like we're on track. And then finally, you have this impact of, both the CENTCOM commander, so the theater commander, and the commander in Iraq, 2 4-stars, who are very influential saying, stay the course, that we should continue prioritizing the military effort, the training of the Iraqis. Well, that argument began to fall apart when we tried to send, on 3 different occasions, Iraqi brigades to do what the surge eventually did, which was secure Baghdad. And with Together Forward Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2, and Roman numeral 3, you had 3 Iraqi efforts where literally trucks and buses were supposed to transport Iraqi brigades to Baghdad to secure Baghdad and quell this sectarian violence. Well, the buses arrived and they were empty, okay? And so you had some very fundamental events in the first sort of 9 months of '06, which conspired to cast doubt on the current approach, on the existing approach, and therefore I think made rather obvious that it was time to review the bidding. Hal, I hope you'll ask us a bit more, though, about sort of this dimension of it, and in particular, if I were in your seat, I would ask, why were the Iraqi security forces, after 3 years of billions of dollars of investment, and they played such a central role in our strategy, right? I mean, the stand up, we will stand down when they stand up, depended on their standing up, right? And Together Forward 1, 2, and 3 depended on them arriving in Baghdad. And I think there's a bigger strategic lesson here, which is beyond the scope of the book, about our ability as Americans and our force structure, our Army and our Marines in particular, to build reliable, capable indigenous forces on a timeline that's strategically relevant to us. And I think if you look at Iraq in the early days, Iraq in the later days, remember it was about 1/3 of the Iraqi army that crumbled in 2014 when al-Baghdadi declared the ISIS caliphate in Mosul, right? And you look, quite frankly, at our capacity elsewhere. So Afghanistan is not a success story in terms of our ability to build indigenous forces. One of the things that ought to come out of this study is, so what for future policy? And that would be a so what on the top of my list.
So this actually relates to where I want to go in my final question, coincidentally enough. And then we'll open it up to the floor for questions as well. In the book, we didn't explicitly seek to address the question of whether the surge worked, although you can't really talk about the surge without getting at that question. We're unsuccessful in restraining our contributors from going after that question as well. And even today, there are a wide variety of answers which are reflected in the essays that people contributed to the book, everywhere from it was a success to it was a failure to it was an operational success, but a strategic failure, and various gradations in between that. And so I'm curious how the three of you would assess that question, and what factors produced, in your view, the outcome that you attribute to the surge, because it strikes me that, if you look forward beyond the Bush presidency, beyond 2007, beyond 2008, it's clear that whatever gains there were not sustained to the degree that the people involved with this would have hoped. And so how should we think about the success of American policy in 2007, 2008, and the relationship of the surge to what eventually comes later?
How much time do we have? So I'm in the camp of people who think that the surge largely worked on its own terms. The list of forces that Doug mentioned earlier, I think, you can't disaggregate the reaction of Iraqis from what we did. So when you say that Muqtada stood down, yes, that's true. That's because Muqtada was scared that we were going to kill him, and which is why he went off to study theology in Qom for the better part of 2 years. And so I think that was directly related to our decision to put additional forces in and to go after Shia militias. The Sunni awakening, yes, but we'd had that discussion before. I remember having discussions with Megan in 2005 about the desert protectors who were out there. We kept saying, there's something we can do to reinforce this. How can we reinforce it? Well, until we actually went in and put additional forces into Anbar. And if you talk to guys like Dave Kilcullen, who were out there with General Zilmer and the Marines, so they were doing some things like taking 10-year leases, and they had never had any intention of staying for 10 years, but they were trying to convey, we're here, we're going to support you, we're going to change things around. And this gets back to the question of leverage and the discussion that Megan and Peter had about Maliki and what kind of bet we were making on Maliki. And on the question of, did he have sectarian instincts? Was it a circle of people around him who were counseling him to be more sectarian? All of these things. To me, he was all of the above. I mean, we knew from intelligence that he had people literally whispering in his ear, that he should be more sectarian. We knew he had sort of sectarian instincts. On the question of Iran, we knew that he'd had an unhappy experience in Iran because he decamped and lived in Syria for 20 years, but he was also dependent to some degree on Iranian support to stay in power. So the point was, until you just told me that you guys had written this paper about getting rid of Maliki in the fall, I never understood the context for a conversation I had with the president and Condi during one of the breaks in the solarium, because you remember, Steve, we were having this conversation about Maliki, and I was off in the corner with, Secretary Rice. It was two former academics having a very academic conversation about Vietnam when the president came up, and I said to him, Mr. President, if you're really thinking about this option of getting rid of Maliki, I said, I have 3 words for you. No din Ziem. And the president said, yeah, that's what I think too. So, but Maliki was able to do things. There was discussion earlier of him going after the Shia militias because Ryan Crocker and Dave Petraeus had the leverage because of our presence and the role we played as the balance wheel among the communities in Iraq to get him to do things that he probably wouldn't have done otherwise. And to me, the tragedy of the early exit in 2011 is we lost that. And, woulda, coulda, shoulda. What would have happened had we stayed, we'll never know. But we certainly, I think, got an incredible decrease in the violence and some progress on the political side. And there's, I think, a pretty good argument to be had. We could have had more had we stayed longer in greater numbers. And it wasn't just, I think, the question of, would we stay on? Because I think all of us who were involved in the SOFA SFA agreement assumed there would be some follow-on agreement, including Iraqis who assumed there'd be some follow-on agreement. But it was the process that whittled down the numbers that CENTCOM wanted to a point where I think Maliki decided the juice wasn't worth the squeeze that led us down the path we ended up on.
Yeah, just real quick, I think there's no question it worked. If you just look at statistically, there's no question. There's something, that chart that goes like this, like a cliff. There's no question. And also, I completely agree with Eric. There's like a romanticism about the awakening, that it was just, guys had some tea with sheikhs and they turned and revolted against Al-Qaeda. No, we were fighting with them, and when we put the numbers in significant numbers to really make clear, that's when it really, really started to pick up. This is the awakening that turned against Al-Qaeda. We completely decimated Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Zarqawi's networks because of the surge and the information that it drove and the intelligence value and everything else. So,
and the JSOC.
And JSOC, yeah. The whole thing kind of fed on itself. The question is the sustainability, and then with a new administration, everything, and I lived through some of that. But there's a threshold question of our ability as a country, and Doug's getting at this, to kind of, after a regime falls, to come in and improve the situation. This is the question that is a threshold one. And in 2011, it wasn't just the withdrawal from Iraq, it was the announced U.S. policy that Assad must go, which, if you were in the region at that time, created a fever in the region. And foreign fighters and jihadis in the tens of thousands flowing into Syria, and money and weapons and all sorts of things from all over the region. And then all the atrocities of the Assad regime and Iran coming in, that created this cauldron. And so I think the big lesson is just be very careful before a president declares a U.S. policy objective. because very ambitious policy objectives, particularly in that part of the world, are very difficult to achieve. But I think the surge gave Iraq a chance, having been involved in the counter-ISIS campaign, which was so catastrophic when it began. We built the campaign from the units that we had built during the Iraq War, and particularly during the surge. I mean, we were talking about evacuating our embassy in Baghdad, but it's because of the CTS units that we knew that were willing to actually fight and that our special forces could get out and embed with them, that we were able to have some traction to begin to claw back. So yeah, I think it worked, but my first point, it was costly. I don't think we can ever forget that. And what we can do as a country to sustain these things is the big question hovering over us right now.
So I'm a little different on this front. Something worked, okay? I mean, we know by data that sectarian violence, the incidence of sectarian violence took a dramatic fall. So the last brigade of the 5 in question here hit Baghdad in June of 2007. About 60 days later, Crocker and Petraeus were able to come back and testify before the US Congress that they saw early indicators of a decrease in the sectarian violence trends. Okay, look, I'll tell you, there's very little you can accomplish in 2 months with an additional 5 brigades. So that leads me to wonder, well, what else was contributing here? So something worked, and I think it's a combination of the surge, Jaish al-Mahdi, the awakening, JSOC, ethnic cleansing, sectarian cleansing, some combination of those. My only point is that as Americans, we should be cautious not to assign the greatest weight to the shiny object, right? And the shiny object here is the 30,000 troops discussed by the book. It had a role. I'm not denying that. I'm just not sure it was the dominant role. And to the extent that we might draw lessons from this experience for future experiences, we should be a little suspect of assigning to ourselves too much responsibility for a positive outcome. I think these factors, I count 5, were interrelated, as Eric says, but I don't think we've actually gone through the sort of serious professional investigation of where the weight should fall across these 5 factors. I suspect, and I'm not a political scientist, but I suspect that if you just compared the physical effect of the surge to the psychological impact of the surge, which was, we're not caving, we're not leaving, we're going to be with you in Anbar. Muqtada, good move, going to the sidelines, right? We're not caving on this. That psychological impact might actually, if we could effectively measure it, it might actually be greater than the physical presence of another 30,000 troops. So it's just only a 20% incremental change on what we had on the ground anyway, right? So a lot of variables, we should just be a little cautious about assigning cause and effect.
Just to respond to Doug for a second, I do think, at least for me, there was a metric, for measuring the psychological change. And it's one that I looked at very closely in those quarterly reports that we used to do for Congress, which was the tips coming in from Iraqis about, and they, starting in the late spring of '07, sort of May, June, really go up dramatically. And that's, I think, because of the psychological effect you're describing.
Okay, so we have time for a few questions. So if you stick your hand up, I think a microphone will find you. And please identify yourself prior to your question.
Hello, my name is Laura Hune. And first of all, I just want to say it's been fascinating to listen to the process and how all the various agencies work together and interacted together to come up with what appears to be a successful solution. Professor McGurk, you brought up the fact that this might be different than what we're seeing today in the current administration and how that's working. The hope would be is that there's people just like these organizations that work together to come up with a solution to leave Syria. But it sounds like that may not be the case. What do you see as different today in how the organization is working under the administration than it was back when you made this decision on the surge?
Yeah, thank you. So I worked for 2 years in the Trump administration. I defended the administration, the policies when I was executing them. I thought the first year of the Trump administration, when Trump came in, we actually had a decent transition on the war, a lot of continuity. We had a good strategic review. We teed up 3 decisions for him to make. He made them. We executed. It actually moved faster. But the nature of the president himself is what a lot of this comes down to in any administration, and there is no process to make these decisions. And H.R. McMaster, as a national security advisor, tried to establish a process, but it didn't connect to the president. So the president of the United States makes major, consequential, historic decisions that harness our country on a certain path without any deliberation or consultation with allies, with experts, with military commanders. It's happened twice now, just on Syria in the last 8 months. And I teach. I'm really not a professor. I'm a lecturer at Stanford, but I teach presidential decision making in wartime. So I'm not an expert on this, but we do a lot of case studies, and we look at Eisenhower. We're looking at the surge. We look at all sorts of things. We look at Korea. Eisenhower said, to paraphrase, good process does not guarantee good policy. But bad process plus incompetence pretty much guarantees a disaster. And right now there is no process plus what I would say is frankly incompetence. I can't speak for domestic policies of the president, that's different, but on national security decision making there is no process. And I'm very concerned it's going to get worse because now our adversaries and our allies know this. And I was in the Middle East last week and the anxiety is like sky high. So bottom line, the process that led to the surge, a very difficult decision for a president, was serious, was extensive, harnessed all the expertise of the U.S. government, and there is no process now on major decisions. And then the administration, and you see everybody, I respect the people still in there trying to catch up and make sense of the maelstrom, trying to fix decisions that were not thought through. This is not how it should work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to the entire panel. This was a fascinating conversation. Going, I think, mostly off of Ambassador Lute's comments, I'm going to ask a question and perhaps phrase it provocatively to get a response. And the question is about agency, the agency of the Iraqi government and Iraqi participants at this time. You've mentioned Maliki, you've mentioned Muqtada al-Sadr and his role in all of this. Is it possible that the actions or cooperations of Iraqi actors were as important, if not more important, than the actions of the US government in the process of the surge and in its, you could say, its initial successes? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I'll just address it briefly, and Brett and Doug can talk at greater length. Almost by definition, because since it's their country, what Iraqis did was the most important factor. So, I mean, I agree with Doug that we should be kind of, humble about, what we can do. But since we were there and were able to play a particular kind of balancing role, as I said, among the ethnic and sectarian communities, I think we could be disproportionately influential in how it came out.
Iraqi agency is really critical, I think, if you're involved in these things. But we had to act militarily against those elements that were committed to the total failure of the entire enterprise, in particular al-Qaeda in Iraq. So if you have 100 car bombs a month going off in Baghdad, there's not going to be much real politics going on. And so this gets to what we did against al-Qaeda in Iraq. And key on the surge, and this is President Bush again, his hands-on engagement. Before the surge, he told Maliki, hey, if we do this, you're going after all killers. That means Sunni and Shia. And we're not going to have any handcuffs if we want to go after on the Shia side. And Maliki gave him that commitment, and I got to say, he lived up to that commitment. And so, I mean, the idea was population security in key areas and really reduce the effectiveness of those extremist actors on both sides that were fueling the sectarian conflict.
So what I've learned over the last sort of 15 years in this region in particular is to, as I've already said, be humble about what we can do and have a sense of humility about our ability to actually force outcomes and deliver outcomes, and rather to try to adopt, and it's hard for an American, right? Because we're so privileged, we're so damn wealthy, we're so powerful. This is hard, right? But try to adopt an approach that defers to the local conditions, in your case, in the case of your question, to the Iraqi conditions. Because in the long run, it is their country, Eric. And in the long run, the effects that are organic to the Maliki government, the organic to the Iraqi political scene, will be much more durable unless we're into colonization, right? Be much more durable than something we can impose from the outside. That doesn't mean we don't have a role. I mean, the classic case here is JSOC, right? So this is the high-end national counterterrorism force that literally is unmatched in the world today. I mean, what Stan McChrystal did to form JSOC into a terrorist hunting machine is unmatched anywhere in the world. So Iraq doesn't have one of those. And Iraq didn't get Zarqawi. Iraq didn't get bin Laden, or Afghanistan or Pakistan didn't get bin Laden. That was JSOC. So there are some high-end sort of niche US capabilities that are unmatched. And we should bring those into the fight. But in the long run, I very much am in favor of trying to find an indigenous answer here, because those are the ones that are going to be durable.
Can I tell one quick anecdote? So we're in Iraq at the end of 2008. Steve, Doug, myself, and President Bush. And it's a culmination. We're handing off to the incoming Obama administration. Things are in better shape than we ever could have imagined. The president had a state welcome. He had a great meeting with Maliki, went out to sign the security agreements. We're all sitting on the side. And I remember that's when the guy stands up and throws 2 shoes at the president. And I honestly, it was such chaos in that small room. I closed when he stood up screaming, I'd spent too much time in Iraq. I thought it was a suicide bomber. I mean, that was my first thought. I thought, my goodness, it ended up being 2 shoes.
The second one of which President Bush almost caught in midair, I think with the intent to throw back.
But the president first was so gracious in that moment, if you watch it, and then behind the scenes and calming everybody down. But the guy who threw the shoes was taken out back, and we could kind of hear him just getting wailed on by the Iraqis. And I think, Doug, I think you had a quote. Was it in this book or somewhere I read? I think, correct me, but Doug said something like, this shows we can do all we possibly can and give these guys a chance, but Iraqis are going to wail on each other. And there is an element to that it is really up to the Iraqis at the end of the day. But that moment with the shoe thrower was quite a moment. And I was sitting right next to Doug when it happened. It was like...
So this is a funny story. It turned out to be funny. It wasn't funny at the time. So we're all sitting at the U.S. delegation, and Brett and I, as loyal National Security Council staffers, were at the end of the U.S. row, right? And the president's up there. He's standing next to Maliki, twin podiums, velvet-covered table with the agreements ready to be signed. This fellow throws his shoes. Sort of wakes Brett and me up. You know, I think Brett said, I think that guy just threw a shoe at the president. So... Meanwhile, the Secret Service agent in charge jumps out to interpose himself between the shoe thrower, probably not in Secret Service training, right, and the president, right, protect the president. The guy winds up, checks the man on first, and throws the second shoe. President Bush is directing the Secret Service agent to just go back and be quiet. He's only got 2 shoes after all, right? So he's now out of ammunition, and don't make a bigger thing of this than necessary. As the Secret Service agent jumped out to get in front of the shoe thrower, he hit the boom mic of the U.S. Interpreter,
who was interpreting the Arabic, right? Malachi's statement. The boom mic swings around and hits the most innocent person in the room, Dana Perino, the press secretary, in the eye. So the only casualty, aside from Malachi's ego in all this, was Dana Perino's black eye.
This is for Brett. Brett, I read in the local news that Kurds affectionately refer to you as Baba McGurk, which means father of the Kurds, and your guidance is definitely sorely missed right now on all the matters that are going on right now on the ground. The Syrian Organization for Human Rights reported that Tel Abyad, which you've extensively talked about in the counter-ISIS campaign, recently that was overtaken by Turkish forces and Turkish-backed forces, there were ISIS emirs reportedly back in the city. So I was wondering if, one, you could comment on that, and second, if you could detach yourself as an American for a second and give some type of what would you do if you were General Mazloum, the head of the SDF forces right now on the ground with everything going on? How would you proceed forward in your relations with the regional actors? And that second question, Ambassador Edelman can also ask because of his extensive work with Turkey.
It's a little bit off topic. I want to give a couple minutes, just real quick. Yeah, the opposition forces that Turkey works with are interwoven with extremist groups and extremist actors. And that town of Tel Abyad was the main highway for ISIS. It fed Raqqa, it fed the war machine. And we used to discuss this with the Turks. I've talked about this on the record, so you can go read it. So that wouldn't particularly surprise me. What happened today is I really feel like we're living in 1921 or something. Putin and Erdogan sat down with a map of the Kurdish regions and basically carved it up. So the Assad regime is coming back to areas other than those that we ceded in the Pence trip to Ankara. The Assad regime will come back to Kobani and all these areas. And Russian and Turkish patrols will begin in 5 days in these areas. And this was all done in a room in Sochi. Partially the consequence of this decision President Trump made without any consultation or anything. For General Mazloum, for the Kurds and the people in these areas, these decisions are now out of their hands. And what is sad is that the protector of these areas is now Vladimir Putin. And it's tragic. And so, again, I am concerned that this will get worse. And we have already collapsed our positions over the entire perimeter of northeast Syria that we had, pretty stable, built over 4 years. And I think our influence now to meaningfully direct the course of events, you talk about humility now, I think if you hear anyone in the U.S. administration say, we still have tremendous influence to do this and that, they're kidding themselves. This is now in the hands of others, and the Kurds and the Syrian Arabs and all those who live in these areas, the fate is in the hands of other power brokers.
And the Iranians. I mean, so just 2 points on this. One, there are some people who have been arguing, and some in the administration are arguing, that we, have not really done right by our allies in Turkey, and that the SFA was somehow some alternative to the work that Brett did with SDF. I think the events of the last 2 weeks have completely given the lie to that because, as Brett just said, these are, in many cases, former jihadists themselves who were repurposed by the Turkish government for their own reasons. It's the reason why CENTCOM, on at least one occasion, I think maybe two, tried to examine the Turkish options and concluded that these were not the kind of people we wanted to go to war with and fight with. And the second point is that somehow the Turkish government was bound and determined to do this. There was nothing we could do to stop it. That, I think, is equally false. I do not believe that Recep Tayyip Erdogan wanted to get into a fight with us. And I think had we made that point clear to him in the call that President Trump had on the 6th of October, none of this would have happened. All of us up here have been through previous examples of this, where the Turks were threatening to go in. Steve may recall the Black Rain operation, which they wanted to do right as we were going into Iraq. President Bush dissuaded them from doing that. This was we've been talking on this panel about the exercise of presidential leadership and the use of presidential power, and this was, in this instance, I'm sorry to say, a total abdication of both those things.
So I think we may have time for one more question.
On the lighter note, this is for Ambassador Edelman. You just mentioned earlier that you bought a book from a French general about counterinsurgency in Algeria. Was that a book on how not to?
This is still a very sensitive topic in France. I actually have very good relations with my French counterparts. And in 2008, when we were having a counterinsurgency conference in Garmisch, Germany, I asked my French counterpart if they would like to come and do a presentation on their campaign in Algeria and about Galula, and he looked at me and said, "Oh no, this is still this scab is really too sensitive to pick at in France." So, yes, Galula's book was, and actually he has more than one, but his books are really about the lessons he learned as a French officer in the losing effort the French waged to defeat the FLN the FLN insurgency in Algeria. They still bear reading today. They're very trenchant and very powerful books. In fact, the longer one he did about the French in Algeria has been reprinted by Rand, and you can find it actually online and download it. But it has one line that I recall very well. It was because I think it applies to us in this context of efforts against terrorists and insurgents. He said, if there was one area where we French were totally deficient against our adversaries, it was in the area of strategic communications and public information.
Well, this has been a wonderfully informative set of comments. So we're going to take a break, and then we'll let the scholars weigh in. But before that, please join me in thanking our panelists.